Good day. The theme of this video is synchronicities and interesting similarities that are 100% present between me and a girl named Michelle Avila, and also with the actress Vivien Leigh. Why I have them is a question I don't have a 100% answer to. There can be many reasons why I have this experience, and reincarnation could be one of them, especially given the fact that Michelle and Vivien and I are really similar in many ways. I will be reflecting on the subject, but I am not saying that I was 100% those people. I do not know this, and it would be irresponsible to say otherwise. We still have a lot to learn about the process of reincarnation and about the possible connection between the different physical bodies in which the human soul lives in different lives. In my early 20s, I learned from my own experience that we actually have a soul when I had a small but very significant astral projection experience. And I also learned that reincarnation really exists from Michel de Marquez's book Saúbe, the Golden Planet. You can learn about my experience with that book and the people behind it from my videos, as well as from my free book Simple Truths of Life. It's too much of an experience to retell it in every video. That's why, in part, I wrote that book. I know that I live not the first life. Two things point to this. First, we have to suffer for all our mistakes, and I started stuttering at the age of 5, when I seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Stuttering ruined my life a lot. I suffered a lot because of its consequences. In addition to stuttering as a child, other problems fell upon me. One of which is a small homosexual experience that I had at about 6 years old. I'm straight, but those experiences haunted me from time to time until I was 18 years old. If I had lived my first life, then I would not have had all those problems. After all, in childhood, I had not yet had time to make big mistakes that could lead to those negative consequences. Secondly, we can learn spiritually, acquiring spiritual knowledge that stays with us forever and passes into other lives. So I had several moments in my childhood when, as if from nowhere, I knew that something was morally and logically correct, and something was not. This is what we could call wisdom. I definitely did not acquire that knowledge in my current life, which means that that knowledge was acquired by me before my birth, meaning in another life. These insights are important to the theme of this video, as they should help you understand why I even think that there is a certain chance that my experience, which I will talk about, could be anything more than a mere coincidence. To be specific, there is some chance that in one of my past lives, I could be the person who will be discussed in this video. I wouldn't have made this video if I didn't believe that such synchronicities can be at least a little bit important. This is where my synchronistic experience with the monster It from the book and movies of the same name, as well as the movie A Nightmare on Elm Street, comes in handy. The events that took place during my last viewing of the first Freddy Krueger film made it very clear to me that synchronicities can indeed have a certain meaning, a concrete connection with us. I have a video about that experience. It's kind of an intro to this video. I want to note that I do not want to pour salt on the wound of the relatives of and friends of Michelle Avila. But given all my life experiences, synchronicities, and now these unusual similarities with that girl, I think it's worth sharing my experience. What if it will somehow help people in acquiring knowledge about reincarnation, which includes the knowledge that not always a feeling of some kind of connection with someone or something necessarily indicates that you were that person, or lived in that place in one of your past lives. For example, there are people who believe that they lived on other planets, and while this may well be the case, their accounts of why they believe this conflict with the known laws and functions of the universe. How did I find out about Michelle Avila? About a year ago, I found Mr. Bones' channel on YouTube. Initially, I watched on his channel mainly the videos about incidents unexplainable by modern science. I didn't really want to watch his numerous videos about killers, but then I decided that this might be a very good way to try to learn from mistakes of people who fell victims of maniacs and other not highly spiritual people. I watched a lot of these videos on Bones channel before I opened the video about Michelle Missy Avila. Michelle was born on February 8, 1968, and was killed on October 1st, 1985, by her former friends Karen Severson and Laura Doyle, who drowned Missy in a stream in the forest near Los Angeles. A fourth person, Eva Chirumbo, was with them that day, but she did not see the murder itself, because she got scared and ran to the cars when two angry girls started pushing Missy to the creek. Laura lied to Michelle's mother that she last saw her daughter with guys who had a blue Camaro. As for Karen, it is rumored that she almost lived with Missy's family in order to know about the progress of the investigation into the murder of her victim. More details of Michelle's life and death will unfold as I talk about the synchronicities between Michelle and me. List of synchronicities. I'll note that in themselves, individual synchronicities would hardly carry any significance, but the fact that there are very, very many of them, as well as the fact that they are quite close to me, indicates that a connection is possible after all. And from the point of view of the laws of the universe known to me, I really could be that person. I will talk about this after I talk about all the synchronicities. Looking at Wikipedia article about Michelle, I saw that on July 26, 1988, 4 days before my birth, Eva Chirumbo decided to tell the police the truth about Missy's death. July 26, 2018 is the day my father died. That day was very significant for me, just as it became significant for Michelle's family exactly 30 years ago. Seeing this first similarity, I decided to look for more information about Michelle. Laura came up with a story about two guys and a blue Camaro. I remembered how many years ago I had a dream in which I saw an old blue car. The dream ended with me being killed by an unknown person, who quietly approached me from behind and cut my throat with a knife. This was the second dream of 3, all of which ended in my death from a cut throat by an unknown person. I wrote about those dreams in my free book Simple Truths of Life. I wrote in it that the man got out of a blue car that looked like a Plymouth Barracuda. The thing is that the Camaro and Barracuda look kind of similar. There could have been a Camaro in that dream. I was just looking for a car model that looked similar to that in my dream. In addition, in my dream I saw that car only from the side, and could not see the shape of its headlights and other details. I was thinking then, what if those 3 dreams were showing me my past lives? But then in the last 3rd dream I was in my body that I have now. Perhaps that last dream is a clue that other dreams showed me something else. Thus they should not be taken literally. Who knows? Speaking of the first and second dream, it seemed that both the blonde woman and the man had been killed by their acquaintances from behind, as if betrayed by people who seemed to be friends and or relatives. But in the third dream, where I was in my current body, it seems that I was killed by a stranger who just happened to be on the same square with me. I feel like mentioning that while typing the previous thoughts, I could not help but see some connection with Eva in the third dream. She wasn't as close friends with Michelle as Karen and Laura were. Eva could somehow try to help Michelle when that was still alive. Eva could have saved her life, but chose to do nothing, a decision that also affected Missy's ultimate fate. Then there are the names. A girl named Michele was the main character in one of my old scripts, so was Karen. Laura and Eva also, to some degree, play a synchronistic role in my life. Eva means a willow tree in Russian. In our village, we could not cut down the willow tree, growing in front of our house, for a long time, until I finally cut it down when I was about 20 years old. My old village friends and I often spent time under that willow, playing different games. Then in Ignatovo, a village of my grandmother on my father's side, there was a willow, and the neighbor girl said something about that tree. I remember this because that girl seemed to like me, judging by the things that she openly said to me and parents. These facts in themselves were interesting, but also seemed far-fetched. And then I read in an article how Michelle and Karen met at age of 8, and that they loved to sit under the willow that grew in front of Missy's house. They jumped on a skipping rope, And I also had a skipping rope as a child, on which I also jumped under the willow tree. This article says the following. Missy briefly dates Victor Amaya, a teen who attended a local Catholic school and sported a tattoo of a leaf with the inscription Stoner across it. Their relationship was sexual but didn't last. They break up and soon after Victor starts a relationship with Laura. Missy isn't upset, or at least she appears to be okay with it. Victor. My uncle was Victor, and the father of my childhood best friend was also Victor. In my book, I wrote about both of them, because both could help me at certain points in my life, could show me that I was making a mistake so that I could correct myself, but they chose to do the opposite. Both once called me a fool, which is pronounced as durak in Russian. My uncle asked, I don't understand, are you a fool or something? And my friend's dad called me a fool when a girl, who I might have had some interest towards, asked, who is this? When I passed by their company near the playground at my apartment building. There were about 5 to 10 of them, and they were walking their dogs. As you can see, Victor played a somewhat negative role in my life. To understand how Michelle's Victor became another clear synchronicity between me and Missy, we need to read the following article. Karen went back to the crime scene with a group of Missy's friends, including the one-time former boyfriend, Victor Amaya. There, they found the words Karen and Missy friends forever, carved onto a tree. They also found the names Randy and Karen with slash markings. Karen, who had previously told her friends she had never been to the place, found it odd to see her name on the tree. She explained that it must be Randy who wrote and slashed the names, and that he must be responsible for Missy's murder. This was Randy, the father of her unborn child, whom she had aborted to spite him. She conned the friends to accept her story, and they plotted to kill Randy. Victor Amaya then beat Randy so severely that he left him for dead. And when they found out that Randy was recuperating at the hospital, a livid Karen demanded that they finish him off. They almost succeeded, only stopping from shooting Randy dead at the last minute. When I'll be talking about Vivien Leigh, we will meet another Victor who also played a slightly negative role in her life. There are some external similarities, which I couldn't help but notice. Some of Michelle's photos remind me a little of me. For example, where she closed her eyes during a flash. I often had problems with camera flashes, and there are quite a few childhood photos where I was photographed with my eyes closed. Another black and white photograph of Michelle on Wikipedia reminded me of Natasha from Velozavodsky Street, House 11/1. It's a long story to tell about Natasha and why she's important to me, but I wrote about it in my free book, Simple Truths of Life, if anyone is interested. Karen and Laura put on a show in the parking lot while Michelle and Eva were in their cars. Karen and Laura yelled at each other and then drove their cars like crazy to the place where they ended up killing Michelle. I remember when I was very young, my father got very drunk, and I don't know how and why, but my mother and I ended up back in his car with him drunk. I remember how fast he drove, and once, at a turn from the village's sandy road to the asphalt road, it seemed to me that the car was driving on two wheels. He turned around so sharply without slowing down. Recalling her conversation with Karen when Missy was still alive, Michelle's mom says that Karen once called her daughter a big flirt, taking everyone's boyfriends away. My first script I wrote and tried to sell was called Telephone Flirt. Missy and Karen skipped classes when they were in high school. In the 9th grade I started skipping school, but it was a short period. I only skipped a week or two. But in grades 10 and 11, I almost didn't appear at school at all. Stuttering, fear of speech, and inability to talk to girls were the main reasons. I couldn't see how the girls I liked, but whom I couldn't approach, start relationships with other guys. They even wanted to expel me, but I still was able to stay at school. Missy and Karen were transferred to another school due to their absenteeism and poor grades. Laura though begins to play a big role at this stage. This article says, she was a sweet-looking girl with long auburn hair and green eyes. auburn hair. I remember when I was in school, my mother once pointed out that I had a beautiful shade of auburn hair. Appearance was very important to me then, and I remembered those words. Speaking of appearances, this was one of the reasons why I tried to avoid fights. I didn't want to get scars. As a result, my own erroneous decisions brought me both scars and suffering. Karen led people to believe, and possibly herself, that Michelle slept with their boyfriends. Few people believed Michelle when she said otherwise. Sonia, Michelle's friend, beat her up for those rumors, and Michelle was about to sue her, but was killed a week earlier. Few people believed me also because of my knowledge and my experience with Saluba. And there was also a moment when the neighbors upstairs saw that I was yelling and knocking on the heating pipes, while it was my neighbor on the right. And I spoke and wrote to them about this several times. They knocked on my ceiling in response to my neighbor's knocks on the pipe. In the end, they learned the truth from the neighbor himself, who told them everything. When Michelle's mother died and her relatives were returning home in their car, the Scorpions song Big City Nights started playing on the radio, and immediately after it, Ozzy Osbourne Mama I'm Coming Home was put on the air. Speaking of Scorpions, Michelle loved their songs. A possible synchronistic connection to me would be that the album on which Big City Nights came out is called Love at First Sting. Obviously, the expression Love at First Sight was the foundation for the title of that album. In my life, I experienced love at first sight 3 times, 2 of which I fell in love at first sight with the same girl, because I didn't know the second time that I had already seen her before. It's a long story that I wrote about in my book, but I have to say that I had my first experience of love at first sight at the age of 14, and the last when I was 28 years old. Dates that are of great importance to me, and which are associated with my synchronistic connection with the movie A Nightmare on Elm Street. Speaking specifically about love at first sting, even this wording has something to do with me, which some people may find vulgar. The fact is that I fell in love with Natasha, whom I already spoke about, thinking about her in the evening after I left her. It's not too hard to guess what the word sting has to do with all this, but you can find out the exact answer from my book, or from my video Psychological Barriers. It would be interesting to note that in the first grade, I had a rubber toy in the form of a scorpion. Once I brought it to school, and for some reason I put it on a chair for one of the students. He was frightened when he saw it there, thinking it was a live scorpion. It wasn't my best behavior. Regarding toys, you can count on the fingers of one hand all the toys I had in my current life. If I remember correctly, there were 3 of them. The scorpion, a plush dog which I called Toto, and a bear. Then, after the disastrous acquaintance with Christina, I was walking by the fountain at VDNH when the song Scorpions, Send Me an Angel began to play on the radio. I remember that moment very well, because it seemed kind of surreal due to the synchronization of the song with my feelings that I was experiencing at the time. Like the song was playing for me. The LA Times article says that the girls carved their names and the names of their boyfriends into the bark of trees. We love you, Missy. And under that inscription is carved 85 Karen plus Randy. And below is inscription Missy plus Karen forever. That had the first name crossed out by someone. As a child, I myself wrote Zhenya plus Yana on a wooden ruler. Then I crossed out that inscription. There are many numerological similarities. 2 best friends, in quotes, Karen and Laura, spread rumors about Missy that she allegedly slept with other girls' boyfriends, for which the latter beat Michelle about a year before her death. Then the 2 future killers spread rumors that Michelle had slept with their own boyfriends, which was the introduction to their insidious plan. I also had 2 friends in the village who mocked my speech, calling me one nickname, which I later found out was given to me because of my stutter. Further, initially Karen was like a bodyguard for Missy. She protected her from being bullied at school. get into fights for her, and then she began to hate Michelle and ended up killing her once best friend. There is a reflection of my life here again. At school, there was a guy in my class who was more powerfully built. I was always thin, and he liked to intimidate a few guys whom he saw as weaker than himself. I was one of them. I remember we were playing basketball in gym class, and that bully started bullying me. Then a friend from my class stood up for me and got hit by the bully. Many years later, when we were in the 9th grade, that friend was already pestering me himself along with another second friend from our class. For example, during a physics lesson, they, sitting at the desk behind me, drew a line with a pen on my clothes. And during the exam at the biology room, he just hit me in the face with his fist out of the blue. I didn't respond back, being a rather friendly person then. In the article, Karen says, "Once I would have defended her, but now I joined in the cruelty. Just like that school friend from my class. First he helped protect me, and then joined in the cruelty." The connection here is obvious. And my two friends and two of Michelle's friends turned their backs on us and began to treat us badly. In my case, I don't know if that guy hated me, was jealous of something, or whatever. I remember only one time he asked me if I used anything for the skin, because I didn't have acne, and I always had smooth skin. He had them as far as I remember. I knew him since the 1st grade, but because of my stuttering, I started withdrawing into my inner world in the 8th and 9th grades. He didn't know this until he read my post in VK, in which I wrote the truth about myself and my life a very long time ago. He wrote to me then saying how many things had become clear, but some things remained unclear. Perhaps he meant my experience with Alba, which I also wrote about in that post. Let's go on. There's a video game called Dread Hunger, where two Amoguses have to sabotage an expedition in order to win, and killing civilians is one way to win. In doing so, the Amoguses can play the role of best friends before stabbing their friends in the back. So, at first I didn't want to watch streams of that game, not knowing what it was about, and then I watched Distortion's stream, where he explained the meaning of the game, and I really liked that game. Now I often watch it on Twitch. In Michelle's case, her two friends were like Amoguses. Missy died when she was 17. I found out about her at the age of 34. I wrote in my book about Half-Life when two very important events of my life occurred when I was 14 and then when I was 28 years old. Both events are related to love and the search for a girlfriend. At the age of 14, I mistakenly chose to give in to my fears and did not approach the girl I fell in love with at first sight. At the age of 28, a similar situation arose, but only at that time I, with difficulty, but still managed to overcome my fears, and for the first time I approached a girl. Then I began to actively approach women, and as a result, I could calmly start talking with girls even among a crowd of people. What's Half-Life got to do with this? While playing the first episode of the game of the same name, I was very tense and bit my lip so that I was left with a scar for life. It was a very difficult moment in my life, especially considering that appearance played a very important role for me, and this is another connection with Michelle. And of course, the numbers 14 and 28 have to do with my synchronicities related to the movie A Nightmare on Elm Street. Next, on December 5th, 2022, I received a message from Sberbank regarding their new apartment lottery for those who pay with their cards. The end date was the 8th of February, 2023, which is Michelle's birthday. She would have been 55 years old. Then it is known that Lori Doyle sent a condolence card to Mrs. Mother, along with a $20 bill. The number 20 means a lot to me, and today that money is equal to $55 US. Michelle was born in 1968, and I was born 20 years later in 1988. Then I often noticed the number 8, reading articles about Michelle. She became friends with Karen at age 8. Karen started spreading rumors about Missy when she was about 16 years old, meaning that Michelle lived half her life after meeting Karen. February 8th is Michelle's birthday. By the way, my mom's birthday is on February 9th, and she is 17 years older than Michelle. On the day of her death, Michelle told her mother that she would call her at 8 p.m. to tell her that everything was fine. I will note one interesting fact. Missy, leaving her house on that fateful day, turned around and said to her mother, "I love you." The thing is, she usually didn't do this, and that day was destined to be the last in her life. I'm not sure if this is a connection, synchronicity or not, but I will say that in my childhood, for some reason, I sometimes asked my mother if she loved me. It plays a role for me too. It has to do with the CLB numbers, which I have already mentioned. Also, during some successful telekinesis practices, I was as if drawing the number 8 with the tip of the string, as I moved it with my mind. It can also be mentioned that I was in the 8th grade when I started to have the sexual desire, and due to stuttering, fear of speech, shyness, and other life factors, I began to masturbate. This was one of my first serious mistakes that had a huge impact on my life. It turned out that this video about my synchronistic experience with Michelle Avila was the 8th of all the new videos that I record in 2023. Irene, Missy's mom, said that on the day of Michelle's death, Laura picked her up at about 3:30 in the morning. I started seeing the number 3 a lot after I found Michel de Marquet's book Cerebral Prophecy. I know for a fact that there is more to this experience than just noticing a number, as is the case when you notice a song playing in a passing car after hearing it recently for the first time. The first such experience was accompanied by the fact that I heard the word "look" at my right ear. Sava was most likely responsible for that experience. Then it was as if I was drawn to turn my head to a certain place on the screen where I saw the number 33. Or I experienced an electric touch at a very important moment in my life, which is associated with the aforementioned Natasha. And looking at the time, I saw 33 minutes there. I had a second such experience when I again felt the electric touch, and the clock at the time showed 33 minutes. And when I came across the scammers and finally realized my mistake, the clock also showed 33 minutes at that important moment in my life. Missy died at 17. For me, 17 years were marked by the fact that I, in fact, stopped communicating with my friends in Moscow. And alas, as it turned out later, they also said negative things about me to other people. There are also other small, barely significant similarities. At 8 years old, Michelle was looking for her cat and asked Karen if she had seen her, so they became friends. I've never had a cat, but there were some situations related to cats. For example, Christina had cats, and it may well be that it was in that conversation that she realized that she did not like me. I have a reason to believe this because of the way that conversation went. Then Michelle had 3 brothers. I'm the only child, but I remember how I wanted a brother as a child. In the article Irene, Michelle's mother said, "I can't sleep, I can't think, I can't eat. It's been 26 years, it feels like yesterday." She said, her voice faltering at her kitchen table. "Not one day, not 1 minute, not 1 second do I not think about Missy." When I was 26 years old, I often thought about what could have happened if only when I was still in school I would have gone to an internet cafe and searched on the internet about stuttering. What if I found Romansnishko's website? After all, I could live a different life. I might not make the mistakes that I did. At the age of 26, I could not let go of the past and live as happily in the present as I could already do then, having all the necessary knowledge. I was stubborn. While I understand Irene's pain, I think she, too, could not worry so much about the past. Tears and sorrows will not bring back those who are no longer with us. Karen was overweight. They say this contributed to her envy of Missy. In my village there was a somewhat similar girl who once mocked me. Then I had already gone into my imagination due to stuttering, and when I spoke my facial expressions were distorted. In general, such fool girls are not to my taste. I have always liked foreign music from the 80s. Missy was a Scorpions fan, but I myself like their later songs, released in the 90s after Michelle's death. The name Michelle has played a role in my life. Michelle Demarque, who had to write the book titled Sailed by the Golden Planet, has naturally played the most important role in my life since I was 20 years old, 14 years ago at the time of this writing. Then, also I was very active in the Facebook group Sailed Prophecy XP, dedicated to the book of Michelle Demarque. I did not often communicate in private messages with people from that group, and the only person who I've talked with a lot is a woman named Michele. At the time, she left with her husband and children to live in China from sunny Florida. I used to be very drawn to the United States, and Miami was one of the cities I considered for a possible residence. Michelle's story partially contributed to the fact that I stopped wanting so badly to go somewhere. I began to appreciate the place where I was, despite its cold and dourness during winter. There is another person named Michael, who was a friend of Michelle Demarque, and with whom I also corresponded regarding Sauba and my official translation of the book. Thanks to him, I was also able to learn some interesting things about life. This audio podcast states that when Missy's body was found, her teeth were chipped off. I was always afraid of fights because I didn't want something like that to happen. Like many people, I also had problems with my teeth, and I try my best to keep them. And there is a small chip on the side of one of my teeth. Daisies and puppies were some of her favorite things. I already said that one of my toys was a little puppy named Toto. As for flowers, I love flowers and I often photographed them, and I also planted them in my village garden. I also like daisies, but I don't feel like I have any special feelings for them. Finally, we can note the synchronicity with it. 1984 and 1985 are the years in which Stephen King's It book takes place. I have a lot of synchronicities with that book and it, which I made a video about. At the very beginning of the movie, the monster It tells Georgie, the little brother of the stuttering guy, that everyone floats in the sewers, and so will Georgie. It then kills the boy. Missy was drowned in the water on October 1st, and her body lay in it for 3 days until it was found on October 4th. According to the plot of the movie It, Georgie was also killed in October. Speaking of a Nightmare on Elm Street, in part 4, Freddy drowns a guy in water in his own bed. How this for a dream? But I don't feel it has any connection. Missy was writing a diary since childhood. I myself wanted to write from early childhood and wrote poetry, but it's of almost no significance. I can also mention a mini similarity, which is that I've always liked palm trees. The neighborhood Arleta, where Michelle lived, is full of palm trees. And in addition, I'll note that the northern streets of Arleta are located about 20 kilometers from the house 1428, from the movie A Nightmare on Elm Street. I already talked about my synchronistic experience with that film in the previous video. Vivien Leigh. Before talking about the psychological similarities that I can see between me and Michelle, I need to talk about Vivien Leigh. I would be embarrassed to write and talk about small synchronicities with actress Vivien Leigh, given that I perfectly understand what kind of thoughts such revelations can cause in some people. But the fact that I clearly articulated the theme of this video, synchronicities with dead people, helps me here. It's 100% fact that they do exist, and as we've seen, I've had a lot of them with Michelle. Again and again and again, I would find them. Having said that, I'll note that I began to read about other cases of similar murders, trying to understand if, perhaps, I would find a bunch of similarities there too. which would invalidate my conclusions about the possible significance of the synchronicities I experienced with Michelle Avila. But no, I didn't find anything significant. And with Vivien, I'm also talking primarily about synchronicities, which, especially after my synchronistic experience with Michelle Avila, can actually mean something big instead of just being unusual coincidences. Again, reincarnation is only one explanation for this phenomenon. I am fully aware that there may be other reasons for this experience, and that I could have been someone else entirely in my past lives. So, a few years ago I decided to rewatch Gone with the Wind in the original English language. Before that, I had only seen that film in my early childhood, when I did not understand the main theme of that movie, which is coming of age, a topic that is so close to me in this life, and which is one of the synchronistic connections between me and Vivien. I will talk more about this in the chapter about psychological connections. After watching Gone with the Wind, I wanted to know more about Vivien Leigh, so I noticed how she tilted her head to the side in one of the photos on IMDb, and I also had a strange habit of tilting my head in a similar way at the time. I even remember how one unknown girl seemed to playfully tease me when she tilted her head to the side, passing me on the street and looking at me. The second movie I watched with Vivien was A Streetcar Named Desire, when Vivien gave another phenomenal performance, for which she won an Oscar. In her role, some kind of connection can be found with me, in terms of going inside of your inner world of fantasies. Then I watched the trailer for her latest film, Ship of Fools. I remember vividly the cringe feeling when I saw Vivien suddenly start dancing on the ship in that trailer. I seemed to see myself at that moment, hence the feeling of cringe. It reminded me of my childhood, when I was doing something like tap dancing on my grandmother's wooden floor in the big room of her apartment, which, to some extent, could be the real reason for the cringe. But then, why did I have that feeling about Vivien and not about myself? Unfortunately, there is another strange connection. It is related to the title of the movie. You already know that in my life there were two victors who decided to utter the word fool addressed to me. The Ship of Fools is an allegory for Plato's book about a ship with a dysfunctional crew. The allegory is intended to represent the problems of governance that prevail in a political system that is not based on expert knowledge. In a way, there's also a connection with me here. It relates to my most important experience with Saoba and the knowledge gained from that book. For instance, Saobans give the people an example of how to choose the right leaders in the country in order to minimize the chance that they will embark on the path of dictatorship. Sao herself cited a boat as an example of the problems in our current way of choosing heads of states. I'll be honest, then I had not the most serious thoughts on whether I could be Vivien in the past, but I dismissed them and soon forgot. Everything changed after I had a lot of synchronicities with Michelle. So, one night, trying unsuccessfully to fall asleep in bed, I suddenly remembered one detail about Vivien's life, which connected her synchronistically with Michelle Avila and with me. Vivien Leigh died on July 8, 1967, 7 months before Michelle Avila's birthday on February 8, 1968. Vivien was ill with tuberculosis, which again made itself felt a few weeks before her death. She seemed to have recovered, but on the night of July 8th, she was trying to get to the toilet when her lungs filled with fluid. Vivien collapsed and suffocated. Michelle was literally drowned in water. As for me, for about 14 years I have been experiencing cardiorespiratory problems. I also remember how when I was still in high school, I couldn't take a deep breath. I could not take a full chest of air. This was clearly visible when I was cycling in the village. Fortunately, over time, that problem went away. It was after this realization that I saw that Michelle could technically be Vivien Leigh in her past life, since she was born 7 months after Vivien's death. I remembered then how after the death of my father, I had a kind of message saying that my father had already been born. And it seems to me that then less than 9 months had passed since his death. I mention this because it's not yet known exactly at what stage of the formation of the embryo the soul gets attached to its new physical body. And it may well be that the soul should not necessarily move into its new body in the very first months of pregnancy. So, I decided to look for more information about Vivien, and I found several synchronicities of different gradations. Leigh was born in India. The connection here is that a very long time ago I talked on MySpace with a virgin girl from India, and it was the only person who I talked to on that website. She saw me on the X-Files group and texted me asking if my profile picture was mine. This was another girl who liked the old me when I still had all my hair, and a lot of people thought I was handsome. Even some guys told me so. And I have to say, I liked being pretty. But we'll talk about that in the next chapter. Leigh was married to Laurence Olivier for 20 years from 1940 to 1960. I have already mentioned the significance of that number. She also wrote over 10,000 letters and documents in her lifetime. I myself from early childhood wanted to learn how to write. I remember that moment very well. Then I was in our village house. In my 20s, I thought about writing screenplays for movies, but life took me on a different path. Still, I made an official Russian translation of Selba Prophecy book, and I also wrote my own. I have always been interested in acting. I remember how I paid attention to how they were playing their characters when I would be watching a movie, of which I have watched quite a lot in my life. And when I was 18, I was thinking about going to acting classes, but I decided to take the time to study English because of the life situation that I was in at the time. Vivien was an actress who made the decision to fly out to Los Angeles and tried to convince producer David Selznick that she was right for the role, and she, her paramour. It was about Vivien getting the role of Scarlett O'Hara in the movie Gone with the Wind. After I learned about the real cause of stuttering at 18, I thought about acting, as I said earlier, since cinema played a big role in my life. What Vivien did remind me of was my own aspiration in those distant years when I was ready for such antiques. But the situation in which I was in my life was completely different. I could not just go and buy a ticket to LA while I was in Russia, and I really wanted to go there. Michelle Avila lived in Los Angeles, the place where I used to dream of going. It always seemed to me that I was drawn to the USA. From Daily Mail. Most of the letters exchanged while Leigh was filming had to do with the production and the belief by the couple that Gone with the Wind would be a complete failure. That fear of the movie being a critical and box office disappointment was then exacerbated by the fact that the studio fired director George Cukor and brought on Victor Fleming to complete the project halfway through filming. And then from Wikipedia we read, filming proved difficult for Leigh. Cukor was dismissed and replaced by Victor Fleming, with whom Leigh frequently quarreled. Yet another Victor, with whom some negativity is also associated. Then Vivien had mental problems. She used to walk naked in the garden and would sometimes end up in bed with strangers. When I was a very young child, I had a very short, thank God, moments in my life when I would get completely naked. I don't have a good understanding of why. It's said that Leigh loved gardening. You've already heard earlier in this video that I love it too. Another quote from Daily Mail. Leigh battled bipolar disorder throughout her life and was observed by those closest to her to have manic highs and depressive lows. Although no one diagnosed me with bipolar disorder, I had moments in my life when I experienced both depression and high emotional ups and downs, which could replace each other relatively quickly. Fortunately, that period of life is by and large over, and I am relatively calm. Further on the Wikipedia page for her film A Young at Oxford, during production she developed a reputation for being difficult and unreasonable, partly because she disliked her secondary role, but mainly because her petulant antics seemed to be paying dividends. I remember the following moments of my life very vaguely, but I had similar tendencies to make scandals in order to benefit from it. What I considered a benefit then, but now I no longer see it as such. Next from Wiki. The tour was an outstanding success, and also Leigh was plagued with insomnia and allowed her understudy to replace her for a week while she was ill. She generally withstood the demands placed upon her, with Olivier noting her ability to charm the press. I often have difficulty sleeping. I often can't fall asleep quickly. Even in my youth, when my village friends would spend time outside until dawn, I went home no later than 2 in the morning because of the need to sleep. Another quote from Wiki. Leigh next sought the role of Blanche Dubois in West End stage production of Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire, and was cast after Williams and the play's producer Irene Meyer-Selznick saw her in the School for Scandal and Antigone. Olivier was contracted to direct. The play contained a rape scene and references to promiscuity and homosexuality, and was destined to be controversial. The media discussion about its suitability added to Leigh's anxiety. Nevertheless, she believed strongly in the importance of the work. As a child, I had a small sexual experience with a guy about my age. I could not avoid it, which means that it was a retribution for a mistake, or mistakes made in one of my past lives. If I really was Vivien, then that play could be the reason for my homosexual experience, which I see as negative. Also now I feel calm about that. In the end, I learned my lessons from it. And I like girls. Everything is as it should be, according to the laws of nature. Another quote from Wiki. In 1951, Leigh and Laurence Olivier performed 2 plays about Cleopatra, William Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra and George Bernard's shows Caesar and Cleopatra, alternating the play each night and winning good reviews. They took the productions to New York, where they performed a season at the Ziegfeld Theatre into 1952. The reviews there were also mostly positive, but film critic Kenneth Tynan angered them when he suggested that Leigh was a mediocre talent that forced Olivier to compromise his own. Tynan's diatribe almost precipitated another collapse. Leigh, terrified of failure and intent on achieving greatness, dwelt on his comments and ignored the positive reviews of other critics. Here we can see a possible direct connection with my synchronicities with it and with A Nightmare on Elm Street, and with the lessons learned. I also reacted badly, and sometimes still react, to negative comments, but I understand that I am right by and large. And if I'm wrong, then I'm ready to learn from my mistake, even if that error was pointed out to me by a toxic person. And for the most part, I have no resentment. Why should I be offended by him if he is 100% going to be punished by the law of the universe for his bad words and attitude towards me? Of course, this was not always the case. In fact, I realized those simple truths when I was 28 years old, approximately after the already mentioned first acquaintance with a girl. We can see here once more the interweaving of different synchronicities and similarities between our lives. We can remember my first dream with a blonde in the theater who was killed by a man in black. The theater is a kind of connection with Vivien, who said that she loves theater more than cinema. Interestingly, the second dream in the dream series where I was killed by an unknown person could also be related to the synchronicities I have with Michelle Avila. Some interweaving is seen here again. Psychological similarities, lessons learned, pay back for mistakes. In this chapter, I will talk about the psychological similarities between me, Michelle, and Vivien. The psychic body is part of the astral body, and therefore, it doesn't die also. Also, if you carefully read Saluba, you can come to the assumption that our psychic body is also capable of storing data or knowledge which remains with us when we begin to live in a new physical body. Thus, if I understand the process correctly, our unresolved psychological problems can stay with us during our subsequent lives. I suppose that they can manifest themselves in the form of unfounded fears of something, phobias, if a person had a severe trauma in the past life which left a big scar in the psyche. Then a person may retain similar character traits, but at the same time they may be different. And even so, material knowledge is not stored when we reincarnate. We could feel some connection to the places where we once lived in past lives. I think this may be possible by means of the data stored in the psychic body. We also need to remember about spiritual knowledge, which, unlike material knowledge, is not erased from our soul when we are born again. This is exactly how the spiritual growth of a person takes place, who is able to acquire and maintain new understandings about the world in the many lives that person will live. Further, I will give examples that could indicate a possible connection with Michelle or Vivien. Michelle was drowned and she did not die immediately. The people who discovered her body spoke of how a look of horror was preserved on her face. I remember well how, as a child, I rushed from the water in the shower when my mother and father tried to wash me out of the shower head. Then I didn't really want to swim, but I eventually learned to swim when I was completely alone in the pool. But I still swim only when my feet can safely reach the bottom. I must say that Michelle, as far as I know from her diary, knew how to swim and loved to do it. If I really was her, then this may explain why the very tragic and terrible experience with water that she experienced before her death didn't carry such serious consequences that I had an incredibly strong phobia of water. Karen Severson and Laura Doyle cut and pulled out Missy's hair before drowning her in a stream. For a very long time I couldn't come to terms with baldness, and it was a very big problem for me. I read that Missy really valued her hair. That's why the two killers decided to pull it out. I often had the feeling that I was living for the first time in a body that was experiencing baldness. I didn't know how to live with it. I didn't want to lose my looks. In fact, I remember looking at my dad's bald head a very long time ago as a child, and I had a very clear thought appear that would be the first time I would have to be bald. By that time, I had probably already heard the word reincarnation, but I knew nothing about it at all. In 1988, a LA Times article reports the following words from Michelle's brother Mark. After the 6th grade, Missy and her friends started using drugs and often missed school, Mark Avila said. She fell in with a bad crowd. She had to have a low self-esteem to hang around with people like that. Mark, shortly before his sister's death, tried to reason with her so that she would find new friends, so that she would understand the possible consequences of her actions. But Michelle didn't want to listen to him. She was stubborn. I'll mention that children are approximately 11-12 years old in the 6th grade in the United States. The word after means that Missy could have been 13 years old. At the age of 13, I began to have a strong sexual desire, but due to stuttering and the fear of speech already existing at the time, I could not start dating. Then I made my first serious mistake when I chose to start masturbating in order to suppress my sex drive. And not only because of this, back then I still thought that masturbation was not harmful, and in general, I liked doing it. It wasn't until a few years later, when I was 17, as far as I can remember, that this activity became an addiction that greatly damaged my physical and mental health. And the topic of low self-esteem also bears some resemblance to me. So, in recent years, thinking about my life, I sometimes thought, was it worth it for me to go to the village in my childhood, where two friends ridiculed me because of my stuttering? After all, I could spend summertime in Moscow. But, of course, there were other friends in my village who openly did not say anything bad about me, and it seemed that for the time being we had normal relations with them. I can say that in the end I went my own way, because my friends and I had somewhat different interests. I'm fine having no friends. I think that my negative childhood experiences may have played a role in this. Further, I never wanted to smoke, much less try drugs. Also, I must say that while watching the TV series Beverly Hills 90210, or however it's pronounced, the scene with Kelly taking drugs in the car aroused in me a kind of strange interest towards that substance. I tried alcohol and regretted it greatly when I got very drunk once because of my stuttering and its consequences, namely the inability to talk with the girl I liked then. Regarding what Michelle's brother said when he talked about Missy getting involved with the wrong people, what about me? I was in companies where no one smoked, didn't drink until a certain point, and definitely didn't take drugs. And when one of my village friends thought of leaving our company for another, in which they drank vodka, I immediately understood why he wanted to go there and tried to reason with him, so to speak. But he did leave, and it didn't do him much good. If my conclusions about the reincarnational connection are correct, then we can observe here one of the lessons of life that I have learned during my lives. As I've said many times, I've had a lot of synchronicities with both The Monster It, which is a figment of Stephen King's imagination, and with The Nightmare on Elm Street movie, which was created by Wes Craven. Both Wes Craven and Stephen King began the work on their stories in 1981. Michelle was 13 at the time. It was the time when she made her first big mistake in life. Same as me. Missy, being a forgiving sort, was excited to have her best friends back in her life. To some extent, I also did not hold a grudge against those two guys who ridiculed me because of my speech and, in fact, played no small role in ruining my life. A LA Times article. In elementary school, Missy was in a class for gifted children, but her grades started to fall in high school when she and Severson would skip classes, Irene Avila said. I don't want to present myself as someone I'm not, and in fact I ended up in class G, the last one. I was probably too shy then, or maybe it was my stuttering. But then I remember how I thought by the end of high school that if it wasn't for stuttering, then I might have been a straight A student. Stuttering was taking a lot of energy and attention from me. In fact, I was a solid good student until I almost stopped going to school in 10th and 11th grades, just like Michelle. Other facts are that I have learned a lot about life in my current life, and I have understood many things that are still little known to others. I'm talking now about Sauba and everything that I wrote about in my book, and also talked about in my videos. In the TPXP group, some people called me genius. Personally, I do not agree with them, because I know myself better, but still. Then, when I was looking for a job in 2007, one of the directors noted that I looked with intelligent eyes, unlike many other people who came for an interview. She didn't have any vacant jobs in the store at the time, but she wanted to help me find a job. I think that there may be another similarity between me and Michelle. Michelle was popular at school. I remember how, because of my speech problems, I could not say what I wanted to say. And I remember how I could not be who I could be, and who, in principle, I wanted to be. I had a very talkative childhood friend who was popular at school, and I think I could be somewhere similar to him if my life took a different path. Going further, I will mention my lucid dream in which I spent some time in a female body. I wrote in my book that both Marina and I were in our teens. Then why was I in a female body at all? Shouldn't I have been in my current body? In my other lucid dream, when I was at school, I was myself, but my height was small, which I probably actually was in reality during that school time. After my experience with a lot of synchronicities with Michelle, I thought, what if in that lucid dream, where I was temporarily in a female body, I was in the body that I had in a past life? And it would be interesting to note that the body type of that female body that I saw in my lucid dream looked similar to that of Michelle's. Some people write that they have dreams where they have someone else's body. Some of these dreams occur in different historical eras or in fantasy worlds. Some people speculate if such dreams could be fragments of their past lives. Who knows? We know from Ceoba that there is such a thing as true dream, but it should be mentioned that some people say how in their lucid dreams they were famous people who are still living. Also in my lucid dream I was thinking about sex. There could be a connection to Michelle if some of the things her killer said about her were true. Which brings us to the next quote from one person who left a comment about Michelle. Missy wasn't the sweet innocent angel she was portrayed to be, which she definitely was not. I grew up with Missy and I knew Karen in school as well. I never met Laura, but the few times I saw her with Missy and Karen, she gave me the creeps. As for Missy, she was one of the meanest people I ever knew. She was the worst bully I ever encountered as a child, and I never saw any other side to her. She was just as awful as the friends that killed her. There were a lot of people who couldn't stand her. It's important to note that anyone could have written that message, even, in theory, one of Michelle's killers. Then many people on the forum disagreed with the content of that comment. I don't know if the comment is true, but if so, I include it, because unfortunately even this material has a similarity to me. In my childhood, when I was under 10, I kind of pestered a village friend who punched me in the face. I think I cried then, and I remember him telling his parents about it. There was another sad moment when I decided to make fun of one girl together with the guy who made fun of me. I already talked about him. Then there was a moment in Moscow when, for some reason, I started to wow one guy in the snow. I am ashamed of those incidents. I made mistakes then, and I'm glad those incidents weren't too wild. Then I hardly defended myself at school from bullies. Only my acquaintances stood up for me, as is the case with Michelle. I decided to show that comment of an unknown person because if I myself had not said about my bad deeds, then no one would have known about them. But in childhood and adolescence, I was always a calm, smiling person, which some people noticed when they said that I would not hurt a fly. And this, by the way, is also somewhat true. So, if that comment is true, then there's a possibility that other people who knew Michelle could see her possible other side, which perhaps was not so angelic. And we need to understand that the opposite means that someone, for some reason, created an account just to write a lie. And the question is, why would anyone need it? But then we must remember that different people have their own ideas about good and evil. What seems normal to one person may seem bad to someone else, and vice versa. Summing up. As you can see, there are a lot of synchronicities and similarities between me and Michelle, as well as Vivien. If we assume that I could have been those people in my past lives, then personally I can definitely see why in this life I never had a girlfriend, and finding a soulmate already seems almost impossible due to numerous factors. Vivien literally took her husband away from another woman, while she herself was married and with a child. She was married for 20 years, and although she did suffer a little due to her divorce, she still soon found a new partner, with whom she lived until the end of her days. What I'm saying here is that it doesn't look like she paid the penalty for her mistake in her life. Regarding Michelle, most of the known facts indicate that she still did not sleep with the boyfriends of other girls. These were rumors started by Karen and Aura. But it's also worth not discarding that anonymous comment that says that Michelle might not be quite the angel she was made to be. I'll mention one story here when Michelle made out with her ex-boyfriend Victor outside his house after he dumped Aura Doyle. Aura saw them at that moment, driving past Victor's house in her car, and she said to Michelle that she was going to kill that bitch, but unfortunately her words were not taken seriously. Of course, there is nothing criminal in the fact that Michelle was kissing the guy who at that time had no girlfriend. But I think that this moment may have some resemblance to Vivien, who, in addition to the aforementioned stealing of other women's husband, also on occasions happened to end up in bed with other men. It turns out that from what we know, Michelle most likely did not make such a serious mistake in her life as to be drowned on the 7th year of her life that had just begun. So why did she find herself in a life situation that for many other people would have ended in much less bloodshed? This means that most likely the mistake was made by her before her birth in the physical body of Michelle Avila, namely when she lived in her other lives. Assuming that she really was Vivien, then this could be partial retribution for her mistakes. After all, the words slut and whore that Aura and others called her do have certain relations to Vivien Leigh's behavior. I think I need to ask the obvious question myself. If we assume for a second that reincarnation is a real reason for my synchronicities with Michelle Avila and Vivien Leigh, then what are the chances that, with millions of people who lived in the last centuries and died before July 1988, I was lucky to find my two former wives on the internet? What are the chances that both incarnations are famous people of some sort? One is known because she's an actress, and the other because her death was written about in newspapers, books were written, films were made, and now people are making videos about her for YouTube and other similar websites. On one hand, the chances are very, very small, but at the same time, I actually found on the internet very important information about the causes of stuttering, and then I found one of the most important books, Cerebral Prophecy, which changed my life so much by teaching me a lot. And soon I learned during the astral projection that the soul really exists. And this allowed me to stop being afraid of death. So many unusual events have happened in my life, including all my experience with psilocybins. I have already talked about them both in the book and in other videos. Personally, I wouldn't be surprised if it turned out that I really was those people. After I found out that reincarnation is real, I often thought, what if I could be that person, or that in my past lives? I understood that these thoughts were not the most serious and discarded them. But nevertheless, this experience showed that I had a desire to learn about my past lives. And considering all the rest of my life experience, the universe could really give me such an opportunity. History, as it turned out, knows similar cases. I am recording this addition to my video after I learned about the so-called Greenbrier ghost. The mother of the suddenly deceased daughter, Zona, wanted to know how she died, and after numerous prayers, the universe answered her question, showing that Zona was killed by her husband, who strangled her by breaking her neck. An autopsy performed after the exhumation of the daughter's body showed that Zona did indeed have a broken neck, and there were the marks of fingers on her throat. Then I had a moment when I thought about Stu from Wes Craven's movie Scream, and a few minutes later I saw a video on YouTube about the house which, according to the plot of the film, belonged to Stu's parents. Whatever the reasons behind my synchronistic experience with Missy and Vivien, I am glad to have it anyway because it has reopened my eyes to what is the reason for my loneliness in this life. It lies in my own mistakes that I have made in this and past lives. I remembered again that I am not the only one going through this. I saw a possible answer to my long-standing question: why am I living such a life? Whether I was those people in past lives or not, one can still draw some conclusions about what I could have done in my past lives, for which I was destined to live my current life. It's clear that, in this case, in my past lives I should have had both love and sex. All this made my life easier again, and this may well be another explanation for my synchronistic experience. This is where the story ends. If you have any experience with synchronicities, I would love to hear it in the comments. Thank you.